Yeah, sure, sure. Okay, well, my name is Dr. John Fisher. I'm a senior lecturer in international history at the University of the West of England in Bristol. Well, there were multiple factors involved. It's difficult to know where to start really, because clearly in the course of the First World War, so long as Russia was involved in the conflict, then it meant that the efforts of Germany and Turkey to penetrate towards the east were limited, or at least were directed in a certain way. That's to say, towards Egypt and Palestine. As Russia fell out of the war, became increasingly debilitated, then it became easier for Germany and Turkey to push towards the east in the direction of the Caspian Sea. So the threat then apparently became one of Germany and Turkey crossing the Caspian Sea and moving onwards towards Afghanistan on the frontier of India. And that was deemed to present a strategic threat to British interests in that part of the world. Okay, good. So can I carry on talking now? Or okay. That was certainly one factor. That was a sensible strategic reason. But I think over time, those reasons changed. Notably, some British strategists began to see a revived Russia as a potential threat, either Russia by itself or in agency with or in collaboration with Germany. So the possibility then arose of Russia, resuscitated Russia, Bolshevik Russia in this case, becoming a threat to Britain's strategic interests in that part of the world. Precisely when that changed from the focus on Germany and Turkey to a focus on Bolshevik Russia is difficult to say. But I think the outcome was the same in both cases. That's to say, British strategists, the more ambitious imperial strategists, saw this as one reason to advance in that part of the world. I think, however, there are other reasons as well, which possibly preceded the ones I've just given. For example, I think that some strategists were unhappy. People like Curzon, for example, Lord Curzon, who was a key policymaker at this time, was very unhappy with what had taken place in the Arab Middle East. That's to say, the promises that had been made to France, as well as to other groups in that part of the world, and to Italy, and to Russia as well. And I think in some ways the possibility of expanding into the Caucasus region became a means of fulfilling earlier imperial ambitions which had been quashed in the Arab Middle East. I think one also has to bear in mind that individuals, the key policy makers, people like Curzon, Milner, Leo Amery, who was slightly on the fringes perhaps of policy making but was very purely ambitious, belonged to a background in which this onward momentum was almost taken for granted. So the continuing success, and some extent expansion of the British Empire was a natural thing. And as these different threats evolved in the course of the war, whether it was from Germany and Turkey or from Russia, or from pan-Islamism or pan-Turanianism, various other threats, or indeed from the French, who were nominal allies of the British during the war, or indeed from Wilsonian internationalism, these collectively, individually became another reason or factors in terms of pushing this forward momentum into the Caucasus. And it was all tied up with notions of forward defence. It became sensible to push forward and obtain the key Batum, Baku, and the connecting railway line and other forward positions to the east of the Caspian Railway as a means of withstanding and securing British interest generally in that part of the world. Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, in the sense that oil interests, the mineral resources of the Caucasus region. It's very tempting, I think, in some ways, to see them as a key imperative in terms of British policy, just as oil was in the case of Mesopotamia, now Iraq. However, my sense is, from the material that I've seen, is that they weren't of huge significance in and of their own right. They were important in the sense of, for example, in the context of not permitting France to have control of that part of the world, or in terms of explaining British apprehensions, or the apprehensions of some British strategists about America being involved in that part of the world. But I don't think that there was ever, that was ever a cardinal focus in their thinking in terms of why they should become involved in that part of the world. It simply reinforced existing strategic priorities. I think in the sense that, I mean, you're absolutely right that the Russian Civil War dimension is extremely important in terms of explaining Britain's involvement in the Caucasus at this time. Clearly there were people like Winston Churchill who was intent on snuffing out the Bolsheviks if possible and was prepared to go to war. He was in turn being restrained by Lloyd George, and Lloyd George's position as Prime Minister trumped anybody else's position, including the positions of those who, like Curzon, wanted to foster and cement British interests in this part of the world and potentially lead to a prolonged British presence there. In terms of explaining their interest in Georgia, I mean, I don't think, if I'm being perfectly honest about it, that they had any particular, any huge sympathy, innate sympathy for the fate of Georgia as a nation. I mean, for example, both Arthur Balfour, who was Foreign Secretary proper until October 1919, and also Robert Cecil, who held a prominent position at the Foreign Office for much of 1918. They were both on record as having said, why not let the people of the Caucasus region fight it out among themselves? So the fate of Georgia in and of itself, that's to say the Georgians themselves, from their purely strategic point of view, their strategic interests, it seems to me they weren't all that interested. They periodically spoke about the importance of self-determination for the smaller states. So referring, clearly alluding to Woodrow Wilson's internationalist agenda. But to my mind, that was, I think, largely, if not exclusively, window dressing. Having said that, there was a small, possibly a small residue of sympathy and a sense in which they felt that Britain had some sort of moral obligation to help those states in the Caucasus who had assisted them against the Turks and the Germans. So that did exist. Insofar as Anton Denikin's ambitions were concerned, well, yes, this caused a huge headache and a problem for the British because, of course, on the one hand, the British were supporting Denikin, and in particular Churchill was very, very pro-Denikin in his efforts to fight against the Red forces in Russia. On the other hand, Denikin was seen as being a very traditional type of Russian who aspired to create or to absorb the states of the Caucasus, potentially for his own personal gain. So when it was seen to be the case that when Denikin wasn't fighting the Bolsheviks, he was fighting the so-called hill state, the Dagestan, and potentially also looking towards Georgia and even beyond that in terms of fulfilling his own imperial ambitions. So it was a very important, and it added a further important complication to devising British policy in this part of the world, which was, at any rate, I think, extremely convoluted and difficult, and for many different reasons, for reasons which had nothing to do really with the region itself, but the broader context of the time, the period, retrenchment was beginning to set in, difficulties facing Britain on the home front. All of these things collectively shaped British policy in the Caucasus at this time. Again, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the British were extremely divided on the issue of Russia, and so far, and generally, but also in terms of its ambitions in the Caucasus and further to the south too. Because obviously, as I mentioned earlier, one of the issues they had to consider was the extent to which events in Russia were creating another hostile force there, a hostile country, which right the way from the Baltic through to Vladivostok might potentially threaten British interests in the Middle East and beyond. The context, however, was extremely complicated in the sense that one has to remember the key point, I think, is that Britain was now emerging from 4 years of war, which had been immensely costly in terms of manpower and resources generally. The British economy had initially encountered a sort of upturn, a momentary upturn, and then went into a fairly pronounced downturn, which led to a lot of cutbacks. So, I mean, this in a sense was possibly the most important factor of all, because ultimately the Treasury funds British foreign policy, it seems to me, and to have an ambitious foreign policy in this part of the world, such as Curzon wanted, for example, to fulfill his earlier ambitions, money was essential, and the money wasn't available. So at the start, I think one sees a sort of collaboration emerging between people like Curzon and Sir Henry Wilson and Winston Churchill, as Secretary of State for War and Secretary of State for Air, in terms of establishing ambitious aims in this part of the world. Leopold Amery too, somewhat on the fringes, not the sidelines of foreign policy making. Milner, Alfred Milner, and so on. However, I think over time, as the limitations became more apparent, then this sort of imperialist platform was whittled away. So from a position at the end of 1918, when the Eastern Committee, the final meetings of the Eastern Committee, which had met under Curzon's chairmanship to make recommendations for the peacemakers, from that position, when the default position would have been for Britain to take over the Caucasus region as well as much of the Arab Middle East, relatively quickly that position was whittled away by a combination of factors, not least Lloyd George's aversion, having won the December 1918 election, aversion to contemplating another war, in particular a war with the Bolsheviks, who were an unknown force. And over time, of course, Lloyd George's policies were directed more towards coming to terms with the Bolsheviks, and of course this was achieved after a fashion in the March 1921 Anglo-Russian Trade Convention. On the other hand, the sort of die-hard Tories, who still form part of the coalition government, which Lloyd George headed, people like Curzon, Walter Long perhaps, and people of that stamp, they on the other hand were still adamant that Britain should aspire to hold its position in the Caucasus, cement its position there, and of course, until the agreement with Persia broke down, to consolidate its position there and elsewhere as far as possible in the region. And this sort of grouping that emerged at the end of 1918, people who would by default be willing to see Britain maintain its position or a position in the Caucasus, so Robert Cecil, Arthur Balfour, Edwin Montagu, Secretary of State for India, Sir Henry Wilson, Winston Churchill, this collaboration, this consensus of opinion was gradually undermined by various factors. Lloyd George's arguments about the need to avoid a war at all costs, the issue of money, the issue of how long would Britain have to stay there if they were to go in the first place. So I think that probably explains why this coalition was dissolved, this coalition in favour of Britain remaining in that part of the world. I think it was given away for the more important reason that, as I mentioned earlier, I don't really honestly believe that the key policymakers in Britain were willing to go to war to preserve the independence of the states of the Caucasus. That was the key reason. So in a sense, the March 1921 agreement simply was a further reflection of that fact, if you like. I mean, in a sense, it was very limited in what it actually meant. Because, of course, it was, insofar as most of policymakers were concerned, it actually meant very little in terms of Russia agreeing not to interfere. It continued to interfere left, right, and centre, or certainly was perceived to be doing so pretty much throughout the 1920s, leading to the establishment of vigilance committees and so on, which took an interest in Russian activities right across that part of the world. And of course, at the same time, Russia was busy establishing agreements with Turkey, with Afghanistan, and networking with those powers to engineer agreements between those powers, which apparently were not meant to sort of project or to be hostile towards Britain in any direct sense, but certainly were perceived to be hostile potentially towards Britain. So the agreement itself may have had more direct implications for Georgia, but I think as far as Britain was concerned, people like Curzon, who wanted to maintain Britain's position there, and more generally in the Caucasus, these were essentially illusions. It wasn't going to happen because of the context in which these decisions were being taken. Well, the fine detail of the circumstances of British policy at that time, I'm not necessarily familiar with, but I mean, I think what I would say in general terms is what's implicit in your question. That's to say that I don't think that Britain had any, I think it was, I hesitate to use the word two-faced, but by this point in time, the arguments had taken place for a long time between Lloyd George and Curzon and Lord Hardinge, the Permanent Under-Secretary of State at the Foreign Office, about the retention of forces in the Caucasus. Britain wasn't going to be able to maintain these forces, and ultimately, therefore, that policy was effectively over. So it then became a question of how quickly could Britain get its forces out of that part of the world while saving face. And I rather suspect that the recognition of Georgian independence was along the lines of doing that. That's to say, well, we've done our best, or we've done a certain amount to help the people who helped us in the context of the First World War, but we can't actually do much more. And in the context of realpolitik, I mean, in the sense of policy making, and that's to say, we shouldn't underestimate the complexity, the difficulties facing Britain by that point. I mean, this is the time of the Geddes Act, pretty much. Swinging cuts in British spending. There were severe constraints on what Britain could actually do. What Britain could actually do anyway in the Caucasus at the best of times has been illustrated in 1878 with the issue of Batum then. So, fast forward to 1921, things haven't changed dramatically. What has perhaps changed slightly between the, say, end of 1917, when a decision is made to divide up areas of interest with France, in 1921, is that Soviet Russia, or Bolshevik Russia, has apparently emerged, according to some strategists, some policymakers, as a hostile threat towards British interests in that part of the world. But Britain cannot, because of its overstretched resources, do anything about this. That is the argument. And however much one might think it was the wrong decision to take because of what came afterwards, because of the Soviet absorption of the Caucasus republics and the part of northern Persia and so on, there is a sense in which it was the only decision to be made, I suppose.
Sort of a gesture, you would say.
That's, yes, that's as it would seem to me.